At dinner, my wife's father smirked. How does it feel being used? Clear your desk by Friday. You're being replaced. My wife and everyone laughed except me. I just smiled and said, how does it feel knowing this replaceable one will be selling his 80% shares in your company? The moment those words left my mouth. You know that feeling when you're about to bite into what looks like a perfectly good sandwich, only to discover someone replaced the turkey with cardboard? Yeah, that's exactly how I felt sitting at the Langston family's ridiculously oversized mahogany table that night. And let me tell you, this wasn't just any table. This was the kind of pretentious furniture that screams, we have money and we want everyone to know it. The damn thing could probably seat the entire cast of Hamilton, complete with orchestra. But hey, I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me paint you the full picture of this delightful family gathering that was about to blow up in everyone's faces like a defective 4th of July firework. So there I was, dressed in my best. I'm trying to impress the in-laws outfit. You know, the navy blazer that makes me look like I actually know what I'm doing with my life, surrounded by the Langston clan in all their glory. We were supposedly celebrating Elise's big promotion at work. My wife had just landed some fancy new position with a corner office and everything, and naturally, her family wanted to make a big deal out of it. Because God forbid the Langstons let any achievement go uncelebrated, especially if it involved their precious princess. The dining room looked like something straight out of Southern Living magazine. All crystal chandeliers and expensive art that probably cost more than most people's cars. Madeline, my mother-in-law, had gone completely overboard with the whole production, as usual. She'd set out the good china, the kind that sits in cabinets for 364 days a year, just waiting for moments like this. The woman had even lit actual candles instead of flipping on the overhead lights, because apparently electricity wasn't fancy enough for the occasion. Elise sat across from me, practically glowing with pride and looking absolutely stunning in that blue dress I'd bought her for our anniversary. She kept giggling at everything anyone said, which should have been my first red flag that something was off. My wife doesn't giggle. She laughs, she chuckles, she even snorts when something's really funny, but giggling? That was new territory. To my right sat Trevor, Elise's younger brother and professional disappointment to the family. The guy had the kind of smug expression that made you want to check your wallet to make sure it was still there. He'd been nursing the same glass of wine for an hour, probably trying to make it last since he couldn't afford to buy his own bottle. And don't even get me started on Cousin Harris, who'd shown up wearing a suit that looked like he'd borrowed it from his dad's 1985 wardrobe. But the real star of this circus was Victor Langston himself, sitting at the head of the table like some kind of discount version of a mob boss. The man had this way of commanding attention just by clearing his throat, and everyone would immediately stop talking and hang on his every word like he was about to reveal the secrets of the universe. Which brings us to the moment that changed everything. Victor slowly rose from his chair, and I mean slowly, because the man loves his dramatic pauses more than a soap opera actor, and picked up his wine glass. The crystal caught the candlelight just right, and for a second, I thought we were about to have one of those nice, normal family toasts. You know, something along the lines of congratulations, honey, we're proud of you. Let's eat cake. Boy, was I wrong. I'd like to make a toast, Victor announced, and the whole table went quiet. Even the grandfather clock in the corner seemed to stop ticking. Elise beamed at him like he was about to crown her queen of the world. Victor's eyes found mine across the table, and there was something in his expression that made my stomach drop faster than a lead balloon. The guy was smiling, but it wasn't the warm, fuzzy kind of smile you'd expect at a family celebration. This was the kind of smile sharks probably wear right before they take a bite out of unsuspecting swimmers. To my daughter Elise, he began, still looking directly at me, who's finally learned to stand on her own 2 feet in the business world. Okay, I thought, that's a little weird, but nothing too crazy yet. Then came the knockout punch. And to you, son, Victor said, raising his glass even higher and practically dripping with fake sincerity. How does it feel being used? You should probably clear out your desk by Friday. You're being replaced. The words hit me like a freight train carrying a cargo load of what the hell. For a moment, I just sat there, fork halfway to my mouth, wondering if I'd somehow misheard him. Maybe he'd said something else entirely, and my brain had just scrambled the message like a broken radio. But then the laughter started. Not just a polite chuckle or an uncomfortable giggle. We're talking full-blown, knee-slapping, tears in their eyes laughter from every single person at that table. Elise was practically doubled over, her face red from laughing so hard. Trevor was slapping his knee like Victor had just delivered the punchline of the century. Even sweet old Madeline was covering her mouth with her napkin, trying to stifle her giggles like a schoolgirl. And me? I just sat there like a deer caught in headlights, watching my entire family by marriage lose their collective minds over what was apparently the funniest joke they'd ever heard. Except it wasn't a joke. At least, not the kind they thought it was. See, while they were all cracking up at my expense, treating me like I was some kind of office furniture they could just toss out with the weekly trash, I was doing some quick math in my head. The kind of math that involves ownership percentages and shareholder agreements and all those boring legal documents that most people ignore until they need them. That's when I felt my own smile creeping across my face. Not the devastated, humiliated expression they were probably expecting, but something much more dangerous. The kind of smile that says, you have no idea what you just stepped in, but you're about to find out. I set down my fork, took a slow sip of wine, and looked around the table at all these people who thought they knew me so well. These people who thought I was just some pushover they could laugh at and dismiss whenever it suited them. Time to change that narrative. You know what, Victor? I said, my voice calm as a summer lake. That's a great question. How does it feel being used? The laughter started to die down as everyone realized I wasn't crying or storming out like they'd expected. But here's an even better question, I continued, still smiling like the Cheshire Cat. How does it feel knowing that this replaceable one will be selling his 80% shares in your company? You could have heard a pin drop in that dining room. Hell, you could have heard a butterfly land on cotton. The silence was so thick you could practically cut it with one of Madeline's fancy dinner knives. Elise's fork slipped right out of her hand and clattered onto her plate like a tiny cymbal crash. Her mouth fell open so wide I was worried she might catch flies. And that, my friends, was the exact moment when everything changed. When the quiet guy in the corner finally decided to speak up. When the used one showed his hand. You know what they say about still waters running deep? Well, that was me for 8 long years at Langston Dynamics. The quiet guy in the background, while Victor pranced around like he was the second coming of Steve Jobs. And let me tell you, watching that man take credit for my work was like watching someone else blow out the candles on your birthday cake, year after year after year. But I'm getting ahead of myself again. Let me back up and tell you how I ended up being the silent partner in this 3-ring circus of corporate dysfunction. Picture this, me, fresh out of grad school at Northwestern, thinking I was hot stuff with my MBA and a head full of dreams about conquering the business world. I had this crazy idea that hard work and smart decisions would automatically lead to success and recognition. Cute, right? I was about as naive as a puppy in a room full of tennis balls. That's when I met Elise. She was everything I wasn't. Confident where I was cautious, connected where I was clueless about networking, and smooth as silk in social situations where I felt about as comfortable as a cat in a dog park. The woman could work a room like a politician during election season, shaking hands and remembering names like she had some kind of supernatural memory chip installed in her brain. I remember our first conversation at some boring graduate student mixer that I'd only attended because my roommate dragged me there. She was holding court near the punch bowl, wearing this red dress that probably cost more than my entire wardrobe, telling some story that had everyone around her laughing. Meanwhile, I was standing in the corner like a wallflower, nursing a plastic cup of what I'm pretty sure was just fruit punch and vodka, wondering why I'd bothered showing up. But somehow, she noticed me. Maybe it was because I was the only guy at the party who wasn't trying to impress her with stories about daddy's country club membership or bragging about summer internships at firms with names longer than a CVS receipt. Whatever it was, she walked right over and started talking to me like we'd been friends for years. You look like you'd rather be anywhere else but here, she said, flashing me this smile that could have powered half of Chicago. Is it that obvious? I replied, trying to play it cool and probably failing miserably. Only to someone who feels the same way, she laughed. I'm Elise, by the way. Elise Langston. Langston. Even back then, that name carried weight in our business program. Her family owned some kind of consulting firm that had been around since the Reagan administration, the kind of old-school operation that survived on reputation and connections rather than innovation or results. We hit it off immediately. She was impressed that I actually read the assigned case studies instead of just skimming the summaries like half our classmates. I was impressed that someone that gorgeous and well-connected would waste time talking to a scholarship kid from Ohio whose idea of fine dining was Olive Garden on special occasions. Looking back now, I can see exactly what was happening. Elise wasn't falling for my charming personality or devastating good looks. Let's be real, I looked like an accountant who'd gotten lost on his way to a Comic-Con convention. No, she was falling for my potential, my drive, my willingness to work 80-hour weeks without complaining, my complete and total dedication to making whatever I touched successful. In other words, she saw a workhorse she could hitch her wagon to. But at the time, I thought it was love. Real, honest to God, write poetry about it, love. The kind that makes you do stupid things like invest your entire life savings into your girlfriend's family business without asking too many questions about the fine print. When Elise introduced me to her family, it was like being invited to join some exclusive club that I didn't realize I couldn't afford the membership fees for. Victor Langston was this larger-than-life figure who commanded respect just by walking into a room. The man had presence, I'll give him that. He could make you feel like the most important person in the world when he focused his attention on you, which is exactly what he did during our first meeting. "So you're the young man who's been keeping my daughter busy," he said, crushing my hand in a grip that could crack walnuts. "I hear you're quite the number cruncher." Number cruncher. Even back then, that should have been a red flag the size of Texas. But I was too busy being flattered that someone like Victor Langston knew I existed to pay attention to the subtle condescension in his voice. The Langston family loved our relationship, at least on the surface. Elise was their golden child, the one who was supposed to carry on the family legacy and all that traditional nonsense. And me? Well, I was the smart, hard-working boyfriend who could help make that happen. They didn't care that my dad was a machinist and my mom worked at the local Walmart. They didn't care that I'd grown up in a house where we clipped coupons and considered Red Lobster a fancy restaurant. What they cared about was what I could do for them. At first, it started small. Victor would casually mention during Sunday dinners that the company was having some cash flow issues. Nothing major, he'd assure everyone, just the normal ups and downs of running a business. But maybe, just maybe, if someone with a good head for finances could take a look at their books, they might spot something the family had missed. That someone, of course, was me. So I started spending my evenings and weekends poring over Langston Dynamics financial statements, looking for ways to streamline their operations and improve their profit margins. I restructured their client billing system, negotiated better rates with their vendors, and identified about a dozen different areas where they were basically lighting money on fire. Within 6 months, I'd helped them increase their revenue by 20%. Victor was so impressed he offered me a small stake in the company. Just 30%, he said, nothing too crazy. Just enough to give me some skin in the game. I should have seen it coming when Victor needed more capital the following year. The company was growing faster than their infrastructure could handle, and they needed cash to hire more staff and upgrade their systems. Did they go to a bank for a business loan like normal people? Of course not. They came to me, their resident financial wizard, with another opportunity to increase my ownership stake. 51% seemed reasonable at the time. After all, I was practically running half the company anyway, working my ass off while Victor played golf with potential clients and Elise smiled pretty for the business journals. I figured it was only fair that my ownership should reflect my actual contributions to the company's success. By the time the third financial crisis hit, I owned 80% of Langston Dynamics. 80% of a company that everyone still thought Victor controlled. 80% of a business that had my fingerprints on every major decision, every successful contract, every profitable quarter. But did I demand recognition? Did I insist on having my name on the company letterhead or getting quoted in the industry publications? Hell no. I just kept working, kept building, kept making everyone else look good while I stayed in the background like some kind of business world ghost. Because that's what good partners do, right? That's what loving husbands do for their wives' families. You sacrifice your ego for the greater good. You let other people take the credit as long as everyone's succeeding. What a load of crap that turned out to be. For 8 years, I watched Victor strut around industry conferences like he was some kind of business genius, giving interviews about his innovative management strategies and his company's remarkable turnaround. 8 years of watching Elise pose for photos and accept awards for achievements that I'd made possible. 8 years of being introduced as Elise's husband or Victor's son-in-law instead of the guy who actually runs this place. 8 years of being the foundation while everyone else got to be the house. And the whole time, they treated me like I should be grateful for the privilege of making them successful. Like I was some kind of charity case they'd graciously allowed into their world, instead of the person who'd literally saved their company from bankruptcy multiple times. Well, guess what? Charity cases don't usually own 80% of the charity. You know that scene in every action movie where the hero dramatically sweeps everything off a desk to make room for the important documents? Yeah, well, real life isn't quite that cinematic. When I got home that night after Victor's little surprise party, I didn't dramatically slam open my office door or knock over any furniture in a fit of righteous anger. Instead, I did what any self-respecting business nerd would do. I made myself a cup of coffee, sat down at my perfectly organized desk, and opened the bottom drawer of my filing cabinet like a civilized human being. But let me tell you, that drawer held more power than a nuclear launch code. My home office wasn't much to look at, just a converted spare bedroom with IKEA furniture that I'd assembled myself because paying someone else to do it seemed like a waste of money. The walls were covered with my diplomas and a few motivational posters that Elise had bought me for Christmas one year, probably thinking they'd inspire me to work even harder for her family's benefit. There was one that said, "Success is 99% perspiration and 1% inspiration," which now seemed pretty damn ironic considering how much of my perspiration had gone into making other people look brilliant. The filing cabinet itself was nothing special, just a standard 4-drawer metal monstrosity in that lovely shade of beige that screams office supply catalog clearance sale. But inside that bottom drawer was 8 years of my life, meticulously organized and documented like I was running the Pentagon instead of trying to keep track of my business dealings with the world's most ungrateful in-laws. See, here's the thing about being married to someone whose family treats you like a walking ATM. You learn pretty quickly to keep receipts. Not because you're planning some elaborate revenge scheme from day one, but because you're not completely stupid, despite what certain people might think after a few glasses of wine at family dinners. I pulled out the first manila folder labeled Initial Investment 2016 in my neat, accountant-like handwriting. Inside were copies of every check I'd written to bail out Langston Dynamics during their first cash crisis. Bank statements showing the transfer of $400,000 from my personal savings account. Money I'd scraped together from my signing bonus, my grandmother's inheritance, and about 3 years' worth of living like a monk to build up my emergency fund. For $100,000. To put that in perspective, that was more than most people make in a decade, and I'd handed it over to Victor like I was buying a fancy car instead of literally saving his company from bankruptcy. The best part? He'd acted like he was doing me a favor by letting me invest in his sure thing of a business. Think of it as an opportunity to really become part of the family, he'd said, flashing that snake oil salesman smile of his. Partners in business, partners in life. Partners, my ass. The second folder was even thicker, Pandemic Investment, 2020. Remember when COVID hit and every business owner in America was running around like their hair was on fire, trying to figure out how to keep their companies afloat? Well, while most people were hoarding toilet paper and learning how to make sourdough bread, I was writing another check to the Langston family bank account. This time it was $250,000 to keep their precious. With what I'd thought was genuine desperation at the time. Son, we're in real trouble here. If we don't get some capital injection in the next 2 weeks, we're going to have to start laying people off. I hate to ask, but you're the only one who understands the business well enough to know this is a solid investment. Solid investment. Right. More like throwing money into a black hole operated by people who thought gratitude was a city in Michigan. But the real treasures were in the third folder, patent applications with my name on them. Dozens of them, covering everything from streamlined client management systems to innovative data analysis techniques that I developed during my late-night coding sessions. Each one carefully documented, filed, and then quietly transferred to Langston Dynamics because, hey, what's the point of keeping intellectual property when you can just give it away to people who'll never acknowledge where it came from? I'd spent countless hours in this very office, hunched over my laptop, developing software solutions that revolutionized how the company handled their operations. While Victor was out playing golf and Elise was getting her nails done, I was creating systems that increased their efficiency by 40% and their profit margins by even more. And what did I get for all that innovation? A pat on the head and maybe a thanks, honey, from Elise if I was lucky. The fourth folder contained something even more damning: email printouts. Years and years of correspondence showing exactly who was making the real decisions at Langston Dynamics. Messages from clients thanking me personally for solving their problems. Internal memos where I outlined strategic directions that Victor would later present as his own brilliant insights. Screenshots of late-night troubleshooting sessions where I'd personally walked major accounts through system upgrades while the rest of the family was sound asleep. My personal favorite was an email chain from their biggest client, Morrison Industries, where the CEO specifically requested that all future communications go through me instead of Victor because, and I quote, "Mr. Granger actually seems to understand what we need, unlike some people who shall remain nameless, but rhyme with Dictor Bangston." Okay, he didn't actually write that last part, but you get the idea. Then there were the financial statements. Oh, the beautiful, damning financial statements. Every quarterly report I'd prepared, every budget analysis I'd completed, every profit and loss breakdown that showed exactly how much revenue I'd generated through my efforts. Numbers don't lie, even when the people interpreting them do. The numbers painted a pretty clear picture. Before I got involved, Langston Dynamics was barely breaking even, hemorrhaging money on inefficient processes and outdated systems. After I joined the team, they were pulling in profits that would make a Fortune 500 company jealous. But my absolute favorite document in that entire filing cabinet was tucked away in a separate envelope marked, "Just in case." It was a letter I'd written to myself 3 years earlier, during one particularly frustrating period when Victor had taken credit for landing a major contract that I'd spent 6 months negotiating. "Dear future me," it began. "If you're reading this, it probably means the Langston family has finally pushed you too far. Remember, you have documentation for everything. You own 80% of this company. You are not their employee, they're essentially working for you. Don't let them gaslight you into thinking otherwise." Signed, Past You, who was apparently smarter than he looked. Past me had been right about one thing. I was smarter than I looked. Smart enough to keep records. Smart enough to maintain paper trails. Smart enough to document every single contribution I'd made to a company that everyone thought belonged to someone else. As I sat there surrounded by years of evidence, I couldn't help but laugh at the irony. Victor and his family had spent 8 years treating me like some kind of useful idiot, someone they could manipulate and dismiss whenever it suited their purposes. They'd assumed I was too nice, too passive, too grateful for their acceptance to ever stand up for myself. What they'd failed to consider was that nice doesn't mean stupid, and quiet doesn't mean weak. I wasn't planning revenge that night. I was simply reviewing the facts. And the facts were pretty damn clear. I'd built their empire, funded their lifestyle, and created their success, all while they smiled and patted me on the head like I was their grateful little puppy. Well, surprise, surprise. This puppy had teeth. And after 8 years of being treated like furniture, I was finally ready to bite back. You know that feeling when you finally decide to stop playing nice and start playing smart? It's like switching from decaf to espresso. Suddenly, everything becomes crystal clear, and you wonder why the hell you were operating in slow motion for so long. That's exactly how I felt the next morning when I woke up and decided it was time to pull the plug on this whole charade. I didn't even bother with my usual routine of checking my phone for work emails while still in bed, because frankly, I didn't give a damn what crisis Victor needed me to solve today. Instead, I made myself a proper breakfast, and I mean proper, with actual eggs and bacon instead of my usual grab a granola bar and run routine, and sat down at my kitchen table with my laptop and a steaming cup of coffee that could wake the dead. First order of business, corporate email. Gone. I logged into the company system one last time and systematically revoked my own access to everything. Email accounts, file servers, client databases, financial systems, all of it. Click, 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 goodbye. It was like performing digital surgery on my own professional existence. And let me tell you, it felt absolutely therapeutic. The company phone was next. I'd been carrying that damn thing around for 8 years like it was some kind of electronic leash, always ready to jump whenever Victor or Elise needed something fixed, approved, or explain to clients who couldn't figure out why their previous solutions weren't working. Well, guess what? That leash just got cut. I powered down the phone, popped out the SIM card, and tossed the whole thing into my desk drawer like it was yesterday's newspaper. The silence was absolutely beautiful. Then came the admin access, my keys to the kingdom, so to speak. For years, I'd been the guy who could access everything, fix anything, and solve problems that left everyone else scratching their heads like confused monkeys. I was the digital equivalent of a master key, able to unlock any door in the company's virtual building. Not anymore. I methodically went through every system, every platform, every piece of software that ran Langston Dynamics, and revoked my access privileges one by one. It was like watching my digital fingerprints disappear from a company I'd essentially built from scratch. Kind of poetic, in a twisted sort of way. I was just finishing up my little digital detox when I heard the front door slam with enough force to rattle the windows. The dulcet tones of an angry wife. Right on schedule. Elise came storming into my office like a Category 5 hurricane in designer heels, her face flushed and her usually perfect hair looking like she'd been running her hands through it for the past hour. She was still wearing her work clothes from yesterday, which meant she'd probably spent the night at her parents' house, no doubt having an emergency family meeting about how to deal with their suddenly problematic son-in-law. "What the hell are you doing?" she demanded, gesturing wildly at my laptop like it was some kind of weapon of mass destruction. I leaned back in my chair and took a slow sip of coffee, savoring both the caffeine and the moment. "Good morning to you too, sweetheart. Sleep well at Mommy and Daddy's house." Her eyes narrowed to slits that could have cut glass. "Don't give me that crap. Victor tried to log into the system this morning and couldn't access half the files. The email server is rejecting his password. The client database is locked." "What did you do?" "I unplugged myself," I said calmly, gesturing to the neat stack of contracts and ownership documents I'd arranged on my desk the night before. Funny thing about being treated like an employee. It makes you forget that you're actually the boss. Elise's gaze shifted to the papers, and I watched her face go through about 6 different emotions in the span of 3 seconds. Confusion, recognition, disbelief, anger, and finally something that might have been fear. "But," my dad said. She started, her voice trailing off like a deflating balloon. "Your dad said a lot of things," I interrupted, tapping the ownership agreements with my finger. "Unfortunately for him, what he said and what's legally binding are 2 completely different animals. And according to these lovely documents that your family was so eager to sign when they needed my money, I own 80% of Langston Dynamics." I paused to let that sink in for a moment, watching as the color slowly drained from her face like someone had pulled the plug on a bathtub. "Which means," I continued, "your dad isn't actually the boss anymore. I am. And as the new majority owner, I've decided that Victor Langston needs to find himself a new job." Elise just stood there, opening and closing her mouth like a fish that had suddenly found itself on dry land. It was almost comical, really. Here was a woman who'd spent years taking credit for other people's work, suddenly confronted with the reality that she'd never actually understood how the business operated in the first place. "You can't do this," she finally managed to whisper. "Actually, I can," I replied, pulling out my phone to show her the calendar notification I'd scheduled. "I've already called for a board meeting. Turns out when you own 80% of a company, you get to make those kinds of decisions." That's when the real fireworks started. Elise went from shocked silence to full-blown panic mode faster than you could say hostile takeover. She started pacing around my office like a caged animal, gesturing wildly and spouting off about family loyalty and marriage vows and how I was destroying everything her grandfather had built. "This is our family's company," she shouted, like volume could somehow change the legal facts. "No," I said, my voice still maddeningly calm. "This is my company. Your family just works here. Well, some of them do. Your dad's employment status is currently under review." That night, after Elise had finally worn herself out with accusations and threats and had stormed off to God knows where, my phone rang. Victor's name flashed on the caller ID like a neon sign advertising desperation. I let it ring 4 times before answering, just because I could. "Victor," I said pleasantly, like we were old friends catching up. "How's your evening going? You wouldn't dare." His voice was low and dangerous, The kind of tone that probably worked great for intimidating junior employees and waiters who got his order wrong. Too bad I wasn't either of those things anymore. Wouldn't dare what? I asked innocently. Exercise my legal rights as majority shareholder? Use the authority that your family literally signed over to me when you needed cash? I'm afraid you'll have to be more specific. You'd ruin this family, he snarled. That's when I started laughing. Not a polite chuckle or a nervous giggle, but a full-throated belly laugh that probably sounded slightly unhinged. Because really, the irony was just too perfect. Let me get this straight, I said when I finally caught my breath. You spend 8 years treating me like hired help, dismissing my contributions, and last night you literally called me used in front of your entire family. You all laughed at the idea of replacing me like I was some broken office equipment. And now you're worried about me ruining the family. I paused for effect, savoring the silence on the other end of the line. Victor, you ruined this family the moment you forgot that the guy you were laughing at actually owns the company you think you're running. You want to know what used feels like? You're about to find out. Then I hung up. And for the first time in 8 years, I slept like a baby. You know what they say about hindsight being 20/20? Well, sometimes it's more like having X-ray vision at a carnival. Suddenly you can see through all the cheap tricks and painted facades that fooled you before. That's exactly what happened when I decided to take a real hard look at the numbers, the cold hard facts that don't lie, don't embellish, and sure as hell don't laugh at family dinners. I spread everything out on my dining room table like I was conducting some kind of financial autopsy. Bank statements, canceled checks, investment records, patent filings. The whole 9 yards of documentation that told the real story of who built what and when. And let me tell you, that story was a hell of a lot different from the fairy tale the Langston family had been telling themselves for the past 8 years. Let's start with the big kahuna, that first bailout in 2018, for $100,000. To put that in perspective for anyone who's never had to write a check that big, that's more money than most people see in their entire savings accounts. That's a nice house in some parts of the country, or a really, really nice car, or about 4 years of college tuition at a decent school. But me? I handed it over to Victor like I was buying groceries, because his precious family business was circling the drain faster than water in a bathtub. The man had been running Langston Dynamics like it was some kind of charity organization, spending money on fancy office furniture and client entertainment while completely ignoring little details like profit margins and operational efficiency. We just need a little bridge financing, he told me, sitting in my living room with his hat in his hands and his pride temporarily checked at the door. Just something to get us through this rough patch until we can restructure our client base. Bridge financing. Like his company was some kind of infrastructure project instead of a sinking ship that needed a complete overhaul from top to bottom. But here's the kicker. Within 6 months of my investment, Langston Dynamics was not only solvent again, it was actually profitable. Funny how that happened right around the same time I started implementing new systems and streamlining their operations. Pure coincidence, I'm sure. Then came round 2 during the pandemic. Another $250,000 when COVID hit the business world like a meteor hitting the dinosaurs. Remember 2020? When every business owner in America was running around like their hair was on fire, trying to figure out how to keep their companies alive while half the economy shut down. Most consulting firms were cutting staff, reducing overhead, and basically hunkering down to weather the storm. But not the Langstons. Oh no, they had a better plan. Call their resident ATM and ask for another withdrawal. This is different, Victor had assured me during that memorable phone call. This isn't about poor management or market conditions. This is a global crisis. No one could have predicted this. Right. Because a global pandemic was somehow less predictable than Victor's complete inability to run a business without my constant financial life support. But the real kick in the teeth came when I started going through the patent filings. Page after page of innovations that had my name on them. Systems I'd developed, processes I'd streamlined, solutions I'd created during countless late nights in my home office while the rest of the family was out living their best lives. There was the automated client intake system that reduced processing time by 60%. The data analysis platform that helped their consultants identify market trends before their competitors even knew what was happening. The project management software that turned their chaotic, deadline-missing operation into a well-oiled machine that actually delivered results on time. Every single one of those patents was filed under my name, because that's how intellectual property law works. The person who creates it owns it. But then, in a series of legal documents that I'd signed without really thinking about the implications, I transferred all of those patents to Langston Dynamics. Why? Because I was being a good team player. Because I wanted to support my wife's family business. Because I was stupid enough to think that contributing to their success would somehow make me a valued member of their little clan instead of just a useful tool they could pick up and put down whenever it suited their needs. But nothing, and I mean nothing, compared to the discovery I made when I started digging into the individual favors I'd done for various family members over the years. These weren't business investments or company-related expenses. These were personal bailouts that I'd completely forgotten about until I started going through my old bank records. Trevor, Elise's charming younger brother and professional disappointment, had come to me 3 years ago with his tail between his legs and a sob story about his failed tech startup. The guy had burned through his trust fund trying to create some kind of social media app that was supposed to revolutionize how people shared photos of their food or some equally earth-shattering concept. "I just need enough to cover my debts and maybe take a coding boot camp," he told me, sitting in my kitchen and looking like a kicked puppy. "I know I messed up, but I've learned from my mistakes. This is my chance to turn things around." So what did I do? I wrote him a check for $70,000. $70,000. Because hey, family is family, right? And if I could help my brother-in-law get back on his feet, wasn't that the right thing to do? You want to know how Trevor repaid that generosity? By spending the next 3 years making snide comments about my reclusive, work-from-home lifestyle. By rolling his eyes every time I tried to contribute to family conversations. By treating me like some kind of antisocial weirdo who preferred computers to people, when the reality was that I was working my ass off to keep his family's company profitable while he was out networking at trendy bars and calling it building his personal brand. The man had literally sneered at my lifestyle choices while living off money I'd given him out of the kindness of my heart. If that's not a perfect metaphor for my entire relationship with the Langston family, I don't know what is. Then there was Cousin Harris, who needed $15,000 to cover some temporary cash flow issues related to his consulting practice. And Madeline, who'd borrowed $25,000 to redecorate the family's vacation home in the Hamptons because the old furniture was looking dated and might reflect poorly on the family image. Every single one of them had come to me with their hands out and their pride temporarily tucked away, asking for help with problems that weren't really my responsibility to solve. And every single time, I'd said yes, because that's what family does for each other. Except apparently, it only worked one way. When was the last time any of them had offered to help me with anything? When had Victor ever asked if I needed support? Recognition for the work I was doing to keep her family's legacy alive? The answer was never. Not once in 8 years had any of them treated our relationship like it was actually reciprocal. They'd taken my money, used my ideas, profited from my innovations, and then had the absolute gall to laugh when Victor called me used at a family dinner. Well, guess what? Used goods usually end up getting thrown away eventually. But sometimes, just sometimes, they turn out to be worth a lot more than anyone realized. You know that moment in every underdog movie where the hero finally decides to stop taking crap and start dishing it out? Well, that's exactly where I found myself the next morning, sitting in the sleek downtown office of Greta Mendez, Esquire, the kind of lawyer who could probably negotiate her way out of hell and then send Satan a bill for her services. Let me paint you a picture of Greta. Imagine a cross between a Supreme Court justice and a lioness who hasn't eaten in 3 days, wrapped up in a $1,000 suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. The woman had this way of looking at you like she could see straight through your soul and was already calculating how much it was worth in a court settlement. Her office was exactly what you'd expect from someone who charged more per hour than most people make in a week. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, law books that probably hadn't been opened since law school, but looked impressive as hell, and a desk that could double as a landing strip for small aircraft. "So," Greta said, settling back in her leather chair that probably cost more than my first car, "tell me about this little family drama you've gotten yourself into." I slid the ownership documents across her aircraft carrier-sized desk and watched her face as she started reading. Now, I've seen poker players with better game faces, But even Greta couldn't hide the slight raise of her eyebrows when she got to the part about my 80% ownership stake. Well, 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 she murmured, flipping through page after page of signed agreements, investment records, and transfer documents. Victor Langston thinks he runs this company, does he? Like he's the king of the corporate world, I replied. The man struts around board meetings like he invented the concept of business itself. Meanwhile, I'm the one who's been keeping the lights on and the doors open for the past 8 years. Greta looked up from the documents with something that might have been amusement dancing in her eyes. You know what this reminds me of? That old fairy tale about the emperor's new clothes. Except in this case, Victor's been walking around naked while you've been wearing the crown the whole time. More like I've been wearing pajamas while he parades around in a costume crown, I said. Oh no, honey, Greta laughed. And when this woman laughed, it sounded like champagne bubbles mixed with the promise of someone else's financial ruin. You're not the emperor in pajamas. You're the emperor who's been letting everyone else play dress up with your wardrobe. But that ends today. She started pulling out legal forms faster than a magician pulling rabbits out of a hat. Here's what we're going to do. We're calling a shareholder meeting, and we're going to exercise your rights as majority owner to remove Victor from his position as CEO. Just like that? I asked. Just like that, she confirmed. 80% ownership means you control 80% of the votes. Unless Victor's discovered some new form of math that I'm not aware of, 80 is definitely bigger than 20. The best part about working with someone like Greta was watching her operate. The woman was like a surgical strike wrapped in designer clothing. Within 2 hours, she drafted a formal notice calling for an emergency shareholder meeting, outlined the agenda for removing Victor from his position, and even prepared a press release announcing the leadership transition. What about Elise? I asked as Greta was putting the finishing touches on the paperwork. What about her? Greta replied without looking up from her computer. Does she own any shares in the company? Not a single one. Then she gets to sit in the audience and watch the show like everyone else. This is business, not a family therapy session. That afternoon, I hand-delivered the meeting notice to Langston Dynamics headquarters. Walking into that building felt different somehow, like I was seeing it through new eyes. For 8 years, I'd walked through those doors as the guy who fixed problems and wrote checks. Today, I was walking in as the guy who owned the building. The receptionist, a sweet young woman named Sarah who'd always been nice to me, looked confused when I asked her to make sure Victor got the envelope personally. Should I tell him what it's about? She asked. He'll figure it out. I replied with a smile that probably looked more predatory than reassuring. Word travels fast in office buildings, especially when that word involves potential corporate drama. By the time I got home that evening, my phone was buzzing with calls from board members who'd apparently heard rumors about the upcoming meeting. First was Margaret Chun, the company's longest-serving board member and someone who'd always treated me with respect, even when the Langston family didn't. Is it true? She asked without bothering with pleasantries. Are you really calling for Victor's removal? It's true, I confirmed. The meeting is set for this Friday at 10 a.m. About damn time, Margaret said, and I could practically hear her grinning through the phone. That man's been taking credit for other people's work for years. Half the board has been wondering when you were going to finally step up and take control. Next was Robert Sterling, a retired executive who'd joined the board 3 years earlier and had never been particularly impressed with Victor's leadership style. I'll be honest with you, Robert said. Most of us have been waiting for this day. Victor's a decent enough guy for playing golf and schmoozing at charity events, but running a modern business? He's about as qualified as my golden retriever. By Thursday evening, I'd heard from every single board member except the 2 that Victor had personally appointed, his old college buddy Frank and his brother-in-law James. Even they seemed to be wavering, probably because they'd spent enough time around the company to realize who was actually responsible for its success. The funniest part was watching how quickly people's attitudes changed once word got out that I was asserting my ownership rights. Suddenly, everyone wanted to be my best friend. The same executives who used to barely acknowledge my presence in meetings were calling to offer their support and express their enthusiasm for new leadership. It was like watching rats abandon a sinking ship, except in this case, they were abandoning the ship to swim toward the guy who'd been keeping it afloat the whole time. That night, Elise finally came home. She'd been staying at her parents' house for the past 3 days, probably having emergency strategy sessions about how to deal with their suddenly problematic son-in-law. When she walked through the front door, she looked like she'd aged about 5 years in the span of a week. "The board members are all supporting you," she said without preamble, slumping down in the living room chair like a deflated balloon. "Smart people," I replied from the couch, not bothering to look up from the book I was reading. "This is going to destroy my family." "Your family destroyed itself the moment they decided to treat me like hired help instead of the person who was literally keeping their company alive." She was quiet for a long moment, and when she finally spoke, her voice was so small I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. "What happens now?" I closed my book and looked at her directly for the first time since she'd walked in. "Now we find out what it's really like when the person with the power decides to use it." Friday was going to be very interesting indeed. You know that scene in disaster movies where everything's going fine until someone pulls the wrong lever and suddenly all hell breaks loose? Well, Friday morning felt exactly like that, except I was the one with my hand on the lever, and I was about to pull it with the biggest smile on my face. I woke up that morning feeling like a kid on Christmas, if Christmas involved watching your in-laws' world crumble around them in real time. The sun was shining, the birds were chirping, and somewhere across town, Victor Langston was probably having the worst cup of coffee of his entire life while staring at a shareholder meeting notice that was about to ruin his day. Elise had left early, probably to have one last emergency powwow with her family before the corporate equivalent of D-Day. She'd barely said 2 words to me all week, which honestly was a refreshing change from her usual attempts to guilt-trip me into backing down. The woman could give master classes in passive-aggressive sighing, but even she seemed to understand that this train had left the station and wasn't making any stops. I took my time getting ready, savoring every moment like a fine wine. I picked out my best suit, the charcoal gray one that made me look like I actually knew what I was doing in a boardroom, and spent an extra few minutes on my tie. After all, if you're going to stage a corporate coup, you might as well look good doing it. The drive to Langston Dynamics felt surreal. For 8 years, I'd made this same trip countless times, always as the guy heading in to fix someone else's problems. Today, I was driving to my own company to fire my father-in-law. Life's funny like that sometimes. Greta was waiting for me in the parking lot, looking like a legal predator in a power suit that probably cost more than some people's cars. The woman had this aura of confidence that could intimidate a charging rhinoceros, and today she was practically glowing with anticipation. "Ready to reclaim your throne?" she asked, adjusting her briefcase like she was loading ammunition. "I've been ready for about 8 years, I replied. "Let's go remind everyone who actually owns this place." The boardroom was already buzzing with tension when we walked in. I could practically taste the anxiety in the air, mixed with what I'm pretty sure was the lingering aroma of Victor's desperation cologne. The man himself was sitting at the head of the table, or rather, what he thought was the head of the table, looking like someone had told him Santa Claus wasn't real and also his dog had died. Margaret Chin gave me a subtle nod of support as I took my seat. Robert Sterling was trying to hide a smirk behind his coffee cup. Even Frank, Victor's old college buddy, was avoiding eye contact like he'd suddenly developed an intense interest in the conference room's ceiling tiles. But the real show hadn't even started yet. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, standing up with the kind of confidence that comes from knowing you hold all the cards in a poker game where everyone else is bluffing. "Thank you for attending this emergency shareholder meeting. I'm calling for a vote of no confidence in our current CEO, Victor Langston." You could have heard a pin drop in that room. Actually, you probably could have heard a butterfly landing on cotton. The silence was so complete, it was almost physical. Victor's face went through about 6 different colors, settling somewhere between purple and what I can only describe as impending cardiac event red. His mouth opened and closed like a fish that had suddenly found itself in a desert. "You can't do this," he finally managed to croak out. "Actually," Greta said, rising from her seat like an avenging angel in Armani, "he absolutely can. And according to the corporate bylaws that you signed 8 years ago, a majority shareholder can call for the removal of executive leadership at any time." That's when Elise made her grand entrance, bursting through the boardroom doors like she was starring in her own dramatic television show. The woman looked like she'd been crying, her makeup slightly smudged and her usually perfect hair showing signs of what could only be described as panic styling. "This is insane," she shouted, apparently having decided that volume could somehow change the laws of corporate governance. "You're destroying everything my grandfather built." I turned to look at her with the kind of calm that probably made me seem either very zen or slightly psychotic. "Your grandfather's been dead for 15 years, Elise. What I'm destroying is the illusion that your father built this company, when the reality is that I've been the one keeping it alive." The vote itself was almost anticlimactic. Margaret Chin voted to remove Victor. Robert Sterling voted to remove Victor. Even Frank, after a long moment of what looked like genuine soul-searching, voted to remove Victor. The only people who voted to keep him were James, Victor's brother-in-law who probably owed him money, and Victor himself. 7 votes to remove. 2 votes to keep. Victor Langston was officially no longer the CEO of Langston Dynamics. But I wasn't done yet. Oh no, this was just the opening act. "I'm also calling for a vote to authorize the sale of Langston Dynamics," I announced, watching as what little color remained in Victor's face completely drained away. "You can't sell the company," Elise screamed, and I swear her voice hit a pitch that probably made dogs 3 miles away start howling. "This is our family legacy." "No," I replied, my voice still unnaturally calm. "This is my company. Your family just happened to work here." The vote on the sale was even more decisive. 9 votes in favor, 0 opposed. Even Victor's brother-in-law apparently decided that loyalty only went so far when faced with the reality of corporate law. That's when Elise completely lost it. I mean completely. Full-blown, soap opera-level meltdown right there in front of the entire board of directors. She started screaming about betrayal and family honor and how I was a monster who was destroying innocent people's lives. The woman actually pounded her fists on the conference table like she was having a toddler tantrum in a grown-up's body. "You're killing our family name," she shrieked, tears streaming down her face in a way that would have been heartbreaking if I hadn't spent the past 8 years watching this same family treat me like disposable furniture. I stood up slowly, walked around the table until I was standing directly in front of her, and looked her straight in the eyes. "You laughed," I said quietly, my voice cutting through her hysteria like a knife through butter. "When your father called me useless, when he told me I was being replaced, when he asked how it felt to be used, you laughed. All of you laughed." The room was so quiet I could hear the air conditioning humming in the vents. "Now your precious family legacy is being cashed out by the man you mocked," I continued. "And you want to know the beautiful irony? The useless one is walking away with $30 million, while the indispensable CEO gets to update his LinkedIn profile." Elise just stood there, mouth open, tears streaming, looking like her entire world had just collapsed around her. Which, to be fair, it kind of had. "Meeting adjourned," I said, gathering my papers with the satisfaction of a job well done. "Greta will handle the sale paperwork. Everyone should have their final paychecks within 30 days. As I walked out of that boardroom for the last time, I could hear Elise still sobbing behind me. 8 years of being the silent partner. 8 years of being taken for granted. 8 years of watching other people take credit for my work. And now, finally, 8 years of being underestimated was about to pay off in the most spectacular way possible. You know what they say about wounded animals being the most dangerous? Well, Victor Langston was about as wounded as they come. And like any cornered animal, he decided to bare his teeth and fight back the only way he knew how, by hiring the most expensive lawyer he could find and throwing a legal Hail Mary that had about as much chance of succeeding as a snowball surviving in hell. The lawsuit hit my mailbox about 2 weeks after the boardroom massacre, delivered by a process server who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else on earth. The papers were thick enough to stop a bullet, filled with enough legal jargon to make a law professor's head spin, and absolutely dripping with the kind of righteous indignation that only comes from someone who's just realized they've been outplayed by the person they thought was too nice to fight back. According to Victor's legal team. And I use the term team loosely, since it was really just one very expensive attorney who probably charged more per hour than most people make in a month. I was guilty of deception, manipulation, breach of fiduciary duty, and about 17 other things that sounded impressive, but basically boiled down to he was mean to us, and we don't like it. The best part was the section where they accused me of fraudulent concealment of material facts. Apparently, not announcing to the world that I owned 80% of their company was somehow fraudulent, even though every single document they'd signed clearly stated exactly how much of the business I was purchasing with each investment. It's like buying a car, signing all the paperwork, getting the title transferred to your name, and then suing the dealership 6 months later because you're shocked to discover that you actually own the vehicle. But Victor wasn't just throwing legal spaghetti at the wall to see what would stick. Oh no, the man was going for the full theatrical experience. He held a press conference, an actual press conference, where he painted himself as the victim of a carefully orchestrated scheme by his duplicitous son-in-law who had somehow tricked the innocent Langston family into signing away their birthright. I watched the whole thing on the local news while eating a bowl of cereal in my kitchen, and let me tell you, it was better entertainment than anything Netflix had to offer. Victor stood there in his best suit, looking like a cross between a wronged patriarch and a man who'd just discovered that his life savings had been invested in unicorn futures, telling reporters about how I'd systematically deceived his family for years. This man came into our lives presenting himself as a loving husband and partner, Victor declared, his voice trembling with what I'm sure he thought was righteous anger. But the truth is, he was planning this hostile takeover from the very beginning, slowly manipulating our family's trust to steal our company. The reporters were eating it up, of course. Nothing sells newspapers quite like a good family betrayal story, especially when it involves wealthy people behaving badly. But what Victor didn't count on was that some of those same reporters might actually do their jobs and look into the public records that clearly showed every investment I'd made in Langston Dynamics over the past 8 years. That's where Greta Mendez came in like a legal superhero swooping down to save the day. If I thought Greta was intimidating in her office, seeing her in full courtroom battle mode was like watching a masterclass in professional destruction. The woman showed up to court looking like she could AR. "Your Honor," Greta began during our first hearing, her voice carrying the kind of authority that made even the judge sit up a little straighter. "The plaintiff's case is built on a foundation of willful ignorance and selective memory. Mr. Granger didn't deceive anyone. He saved their company. Multiple times." She started pulling out documents like a magician doing the world's most boring card trick, except instead of entertainment, she was dealing out cold, hard facts that systematically demolished every argument Victor's lawyer had tried to make. Here are the bank records showing Mr. Granger's initial investment of $400,000 in 2018, when Langston Dynamics was 3 months away from bankruptcy. She continued, sliding papers across the table with the precision of a surgeon making an incision. Here are the signed agreements acknowledging his ownership stake. Here are the patent applications filed under his name and subsequently transferred to the company. Victor's lawyer, a guy named Harrison Webb who looked like he'd stepped out of a men's fashion magazine and probably charged accordingly, tried to interrupt with some nonsense about undue influence and family pressure. Greta shut him down faster than a bouncer at closing time. "Undue influence," she repeated, her eyebrows raising in a way that suggested she'd just heard the most ridiculous thing since someone tried to convince her that the earth was flat. "Mr. Webb, your client literally begged my client for money. Twice. We have the phone records, the emails, and the witness statements from board members who were present during those discussions." The best moment came when Victor himself took the stand to testify about how I'd supposedly manipulated him into signing away his company. The man sat there in his best suit, looking like a deer caught in headlights, trying to explain to a judge how someone could trick him into accepting hundreds of thousands of dollars in exchange for ownership shares. "So let me understand this correctly," the judge said, looking at Victor over his reading glasses with the expression of someone who'd just been asked to believe that water flows uphill. "Mr. Granger forced you to accept his money?" "Well, no, Your Honor, but..." "And he forced you to sign the ownership agreements?" "Not exactly forced, but he didn't explain." "Mr. Langston, are you or are you not a college-educated business owner who's been running a company for over 20 years? Victor's face went through several interesting color changes before he managed to mumble something that might have been an affirmative response. "Then I'm having trouble understanding how someone could trick you into signing legal documents that you presumably read before putting your signature on them. Game, set, and match to our side." But Greta wasn't finished yet. "Oh no, she was just getting warmed up." "Your Honor," she said, rising from her seat like an avenging angel of justice. Not only is this lawsuit completely without merit, but it represents a frivolous attempt to use the court system to relitigate a business decision that the plaintiff now regrets. Mr. Granger invested his own money, saved their company, and legally acquired ownership through signed agreements. The fact that Mr. Langston is now unhappy with the consequences of his own decisions does not constitute grounds for legal action. Then came the coup de grace. Furthermore, Your Honor, we're requesting that the court award attorney's fees to my client, as this case clearly falls under the state's frivolous litigation statute. I watched Victor's face crumble as the judge announced his decision. Not only was the lawsuit dismissed with prejudice, meaning Victor couldn't try to sue me again for the same thing, but he was also ordered to pay our legal fees, which, considering Greta's hourly rate, probably cost him more than most people's annual salaries. The man walked out of that courtroom looking like he'd aged about 10 years in the span of 2 hours. His expensive lawyer was already packing up his briefcase and probably calculating how much of his retainer he'd get to keep after this spectacular failure. As for me, I walked out of there feeling like I'd just won the lottery, the Super Bowl, and a Nobel Prize all at the same time. Victor had thrown everything he had at me, hired the best legal representation money could buy, and basically bet his remaining dignity on the chance that a judge would somehow undo 8 years of signed contracts and documented investments. And he'd lost. Spectacularly. Justice, it turns out, has a pretty good sense of humor, especially when it comes to people who bite the hand that literally fed them for almost a decade. You know that feeling when you finally take off shoes that have been pinching your feet all day? That moment when you realize you'd gotten so used to the constant discomfort that you'd forgotten what it felt like to not be in pain? That's exactly how I felt when the company sale finally went through and I walked away with a check for $28.8 million, my 80% cut of the $36 million sale price. $28.8 million. Let me just say that again for emphasis, because even now, 6 months later, sometimes I still have to pinch myself to make sure I'm not dreaming. $28.8 million for 8 years of being treated like the family pet who happened to be really good at math. The first thing I did with that money? I bought myself a cabin on Lake Norman in North Carolina, about as far away from the Langston family drama as I could get without actually leaving the country. And when I say cabin, I don't mean some rustic little shack with an outhouse and a wood-burning stove. I mean a 4-bedroom, 3-bathroom cabin with a gourmet kitchen, a wraparound porch that overlooks the water, and enough space to host a small army if I ever felt like being social again. Which, to be honest, I didn't. Not for a while, anyway. After 8 years of constant noise, board meetings, client calls, family dinners where I was expected to smile and nod while being systematically dismissed, the silence was absolutely golden. No more phone calls at 7 in the morning from Victor asking me to fix something that any competent business owner should have been able to handle themselves. No more emails marked urgent that turned out to be requests for me to explain basic financial concepts to grown adults who supposedly ran a consulting company. No more Elise rolling her eyes when I tried to contribute to conversations about the business I was literally funding. Just me, a lake full of fish who didn't care about my opinion on quarterly profit margins, and enough money to never have to care about anyone else's problems ever again. The funny thing about suddenly having more money than you know what to do with is that you start discovering who you actually are when you're not constantly trying to please other people. Turns out, I'm a guy who likes to paint. Who knew? Certainly not me, until I wandered into an art supply store in the nearby town of Davidson and came out with enough brushes, canvases, and oil paints to supply a small art school. I started with landscapes, because how hard could it be to paint trees and water, right? Wrong. Apparently, there's a difference between tree-shaped green blob and majestic oak casting shadows across pristine lake water. But here's the beautiful thing about having enough money to never work again. You can afford to suck at something for as long as it takes to get good at it. So I sucked at painting for about 3 months, producing canvases that looked like they'd been created by a colorblind kindergartner having an emotional breakdown. But slowly, gradually, something started to click. The trees began to look like actual trees instead of green cotton candy. The water started reflecting light instead of looking like blue cement. The sunsets stopped resembling abstract expressionist nightmares and began to capture something that actually resembled the gorgeous views from my porch. Fishing was easier to pick up, probably because fish don't care if your technique is perfect as long as your bait is tasty. I get up at sunrise, make myself a proper breakfast. Bacon, eggs, toast, the whole 9 yards instead of grabbing a granola bar and running out the door, and then spend the morning on my dock with a fishing rod and absolutely nothing to prove to anyone. You want to know what 8 years of stress does to a person? I didn't realize how wound up I'd been until I finally started to relax. My shoulders, which had apparently been permanently hunched around my ears, slowly descended to their normal position. The tension headaches that I'd thought were just a normal part of adult life disappeared completely. I started sleeping through the night instead of waking up at 3 a.m. with my brain already spinning through the next day's problems. For the first time since college, I remembered what it felt like to just exist without constantly calculating, analyzing, or fixing something for someone else. The isolation was exactly what I needed, at least for the first few months. But eventually, even the most determined hermit starts to miss human interaction, especially when that interaction doesn't involve people who think you owe them something just for existing. That's when I started getting to know my neighbors, most of whom were retirees who'd moved to the lake for the same reason I had: peace and quiet. There was Bob and Martha, a couple in their 70s who'd built their house on the lake 20 years earlier and knew every fish in the water by name. There was Jennifer, a widow in her 60s who ran a small pottery studio out of her garage and made the most amazing coffee I'd ever tasted. None of them knew about my previous life, and I liked it that way. To them, I was just the guy in the cabin who painted terrible landscapes and occasionally caught fish. I wasn't the silent partner, the underappreciated son-in-law, or the guy who'd been systematically taken advantage of for the better part of a decade. I was just me, whoever that turned out to be. About 4 months after I'd settled into my new life, I got a call from Margaret Shun, the former board member who'd supported me during the whole corporate coup. She'd heard through the business grapevine about what had happened to the various members of the Langston family after the dust had settled. Victor, apparently, had moved in with his sister in Florida because his legal fees from the failed lawsuit had pretty much wiped out his savings. The man who'd spent 8 years acting like he was some kind of business royalty was now living in a guest bedroom and helping his sister run her small accounting practice. Trevor, my former brother-in-law and professional disappointment, had tried to start another tech company with the money he'd managed to save from his trust fund. It lasted about 6 months before folding, leaving him back where he started, broke and living with his parents. And Elise? Well, that was the most interesting story of all. My soon-to-be ex-wife had apparently decided to reinvent herself as a social media influencer, posting inspirational quotes and business advice on Instagram, while carefully cropping out the part of her life where she no longer had access to the family company or the lifestyle it had provided. Her bio still listed her as CEO of Langston Dynamics, which would have been hilarious if it wasn't so pathetic. She's got about 15,000 followers, Margaret told me with barely concealed amusement. Most of her posts get maybe 50 likes, and half of those are probably from bots. I found myself feeling something that wasn't quite pity, but wasn't satisfaction either. More like the kind of detached curiosity you might have when reading about strangers in the newspaper. These people who had once seemed so important, so central to my daily existence, had become characters in someone else's story. They were living their lives, dealing with the consequences of treating people badly, and I was living mine, finally free to figure out who I was when I wasn't constantly trying to earn approval from people who were never going to give it anyway. The divorce papers came through on a Tuesday, delivered to my lakeside mailbox like any other piece of mail. 8 years of marriage, officially dissolved with the stroke of a judge's pen. Elise kept the house in town, the one I'd paid for with my signing bonus from my first job, and I kept my freedom. Best trade I ever made. You know what's funny about becoming the villain in someone else's story? Eventually, people start asking you questions like you're some kind of evil mastermind who planned the whole thing from the beginning, instead of just a guy who finally got tired of being treated like furniture and decided to remind everyone that furniture doesn't usually own 80% of the company. It happens about once a month now. I'll be at the hardware store picking up supplies for whatever project I'm working on around the cabin, or at the local diner ordering what Bob calls the best damn pancakes in North Carolina, and someone will recognize me. Word travels fast in small towns. especially when that word involves someone who used to be married to a woman who now spends her time posting motivational quotes on Instagram while pretending she still runs a company that doesn't exist anymore. The conversation always starts the same way. They'll sidle up to me with that look people get when they want to ask something juicy, but aren't sure if they should, like they're trying to figure out if I'm the kind of person who'll punch them for being nosy or buy them a beer and tell them the whole story. Aren't you the guy who? They'll begin and then trail off like they're not sure how to finish that sentence without sounding like they're asking for gossip. And I always give them the same answer, delivered with the kind of smile that says I've made peace with being the bad guy in this particular fairy tale. Yeah, I'll say, usually while continuing whatever I was doing like the conversation isn't particularly interesting to me anymore. I'm the guy who reminded his in-laws that treating people like crap has consequences. That's when they lean in closer, because everyone loves a good story about rich people getting their comeuppance, especially when it involves family drama and enough money to make the local news. But how did it feel? They always ask, and you can tell they're expecting some kind of dramatic response. Maybe they think I'll break down and confess that revenge is hollow, or launch into a speech about how money can't buy happiness, or admit that I regret destroying the Langston family's precious legacy. Sorry to disappoint, folks, but that's not how this story ends. How did it feel when they laughed at you? The curious stranger will press, probably hoping for tears or anger or some kind of emotional breakdown that would make for better storytelling at their next dinner party. And that's when I give them the answer that usually makes them step back a little, because it's not what they're expecting to hear from someone who's supposed to be either a victim or a monster, depending on which version of the story they've heard. They weren't laughing at me, I'll say, my voice calm as a summer morning on the lake. They were laughing at a man they didn't know. Because that's the truth of it, really. For 8 years, the Langston family thought they knew exactly who I was. They saw a quiet guy who wrote checks and fixed problems and never complained when other people took credit for his work. They saw someone who was grateful to be included in their little dynasty, someone who understood his place in the hierarchy and was content to stay there. They saw exactly what I let them see, because it was easier than constantly fighting for recognition that was never going to come anyway. But they never saw the guy who was keeping detailed records of every investment, every patent, every contribution that built their success. They never saw the man who was quietly accumulating enough ownership to control their entire world. They never saw someone who was perfectly capable of playing the long game and winning it in spectacular fashion. They thought they knew me, but they only knew the version of me that was convenient for them. And now they do know me. Finally, because when the useless one walks away, sometimes the whole empire goes with him. Sometimes the quiet guy in the corner turns out to be the foundation that everything else was built on. And when he decides he's tired of being stepped on, the whole damn house comes tumbling down. The funny thing is, I didn't set out to destroy their lives. I set out to build something, to contribute to something, to be part of something bigger than myself. For 8 years, I poured my heart, my money, my ideas, and my effort into making Langston Dynamics successful, thinking that eventually my contributions would be recognized and valued. I was wrong about that, but I was right about something else. I was building something bigger than myself. I just didn't realize that what I was building was my own independence. Every investment I made, every patent I filed, every system I created was another brick in the foundation of my freedom. Every time Victor dismissed my ideas, every time Elise rolled her eyes at my suggestions, every time the family treated me like hired help instead of the guy who was literally keeping their company alive, they were giving me another reason to stop caring about their approval. By the time they figured out who really held the power in our relationship, it was too late to change the dynamic. The contracts were signed, the ownership was transferred, and the quiet guy had become the man with all the cards. Some people ask me if I planned it that way from the beginning, like I was some kind of strategic genius who saw 8 years into the future and orchestrated the perfect revenge. The truth is much simpler and probably more dangerous for people who think they can take advantage of nice guys forever. I didn't plan to take over their company. I just planned to never be powerless again. And sometimes, if you're smart about it, those two things turn out to be the same thing. These days, I wake up every morning in a house that I bought with money I earned, surrounded by paintings that I created with my own hands, looking out at a lake that belongs to me in the truest sense, not because I own the water, but because I chose to be here and I can choose to leave whenever I want. I've built something better than what I had before. Not just financially, though having enough money to never worry about paying bills is pretty nice. I've built a life where I don't have to prove my worth to anyone, where my contributions are valued because I'm the only one making them, where no one can take credit for my work because no one else is around to steal it. I've built a kingdom where I'm the only citizen, and let me tell you, it's a pretty peaceful place to live. Victor was right about one thing, though he probably didn't mean it the way it came out. I was being used. For 8 years, I let myself be used by people who took my generosity for granted and mistook my kindness for weakness. But here's what he didn't understand about being used. Sometimes the person getting used is keeping track of exactly how much they're worth. And sometimes, when they finally decide they've had enough, they take their